18 people, 18 witnesses ready to testify that Scott Minton was somewhere else entirely when the crime occurred. Add to that time-stamped receipts from multiple stores in a different county. By any reasonable standard, this should have been an open and shut case of innocence. The evidence was overwhelming. It didn't matter. Scott Minton spent 31 years in prison anyway. This is Case Files Explained. Today, we examine how one of the most well-documented alibis in American legal history was simply ignored and what that tells us about justice. In 1993, a brutal crime shattered the quiet of Cleveland, Tennessee. A woman was kidnapped, robbed, and raped. Police needed answers. The community demanded them. Within days, investigators had their suspect. Within months, they had their conviction. Within years, the cracks in their case would become canyons. But by then, a man's life had already been taken from him. How does a man with 18 alibi witnesses end up convicted? How does physical evidence that points away from him get overlooked? The answers reveal something broken. Scott Minton was 24 years old in 1993. He lived with an intellectual disability that made him functionally illiterate. He worked odd jobs. He had no criminal history. What he did have was a vulnerability. Research consistently shows that people with intellectual disabilities are at heightened risk of giving false confessions under police pressure. They struggle to understand the long-term consequences of their words. They often want to please authority figures. They are suggestible in ways interrogators can exploit. The Innocence Project has documented this pattern in case after case. Approximately 29% of DNA exonerations involve false confessions. Many of those defendants were cognitively impaired. On the night of the crime in 1993, Scott Minton was not in Cleveland, Tennessee. He was in a different county, entirely Hamilton County, and he had the receipts to prove it. Time-stamped receipts from multiple stores placed him miles away during the window when the attack occurred. These weren't his claims alone. They were documented transactions. Beyond the paper trail, there were witnesses. Not one or two, not 5 or 6, 18 separate individuals confirmed Scott Minton was with them in Hamilton County. Family members, friends, store clerks who remembered him. People with no reason to lie and every reason to tell the truth. The defense had built an ironclad alibi, and yet none of it mattered. Because by the time those witnesses took the stand, prosecutors had something they considered more powerful: Scott Minton's own words. Police interrogated Minton 3 times over 3 days. According to case records, they used psychologically coercive techniques. They lied to him about evidence that didn't exist. They isolated him in a cell without water. For a man with an intellectual disability who struggled to understand what was happening, the pressure was overwhelming. He eventually told them what they wanted to hear. Not because it was true, but because he didn't know how to make them stop. This is the anatomy of a false confession. The victim herself initially could not identify Minton. On the day of the crime, she viewed a photo array containing his picture. She did not pick him out. This is significant. Statistical analysis of eyewitness identification shows that suspects not identified at the first opportunity typically had no involvement in the crime. But 2 days later, after being shown a live lineup, the victim identified Minton. What happened in those intervening 48 hours? The record doesn't fully explain. No physical evidence ever connected Scott Minton to the crime. No DNA, no fingerprints. Nothing placing him at the scene. The prosecution's case rested on 2 things: the confession and the identification. In 1994, the jury delivered its verdict, guilty. Scott Minton was convicted of aggravated rape, kidnapping, and robbery. He was sentenced to decades in prison. 18 witnesses. Time-stamped receipts. 0 physical evidence. None of it was enough to overcome a coerced confession and a questionable identification. Years turned into decades. Scott Minton maintained his innocence from inside prison walls. He never stopped saying he didn't do it. Few were listening. But science was advancing. Understanding of false confessions deepened. Eyewitness identification research revealed how unreliable memory could be, especially under stress. The Innocence Project and Tennessee Innocence Project eventually took up Minton's case. They began the long, meticulous work of demonstrating what the original trial had ignored. They brought in experts on false confessions. They presented new research on eyewitness identification. They showed how the science that existed in 1994 had been misunderstood or disregarded. And they had something else, something unexpected. The victim's family had come to believe that Scott Minton was not the man who had attacked their loved one. The victim's family supported Minton's efforts for release. They recognized what the evidence suggested: the real perpetrator was still unknown, and an innocent man sat in prison. On December 10, 2024, Judge Amanda Dunn heard the evidence. She reviewed the expert testimony. She examined the case through the lens of 3 decades of scientific advancement. She vacated Scott Minton's conviction. After 31 years, the legal system acknowledged what 18 witnesses had known all along: this man did not commit this crime. On January 23, 2025, all charges were dismissed. Scott Minton was officially exonerated. He walked out of the justice system that had failed him finally, a free man. He was 55 years old. He had entered prison at 24. He had lost his 20s, his 30s, his 40s. He had lost most of his life to a crime he did not commit. A headline captured it simply: 30 years of his life stolen. The mathematics of wrongful conviction are brutal. Each day lost is a day that can never be returned. The Minton case is not unique. It fits a pattern that innocence organizations have documented across hundreds of exonerations. The same failures appear again and again. False confessions, eyewitness misidentification, inadequate defense resources, tunnel vision by investigators who lock onto a suspect and stop looking for anyone else. The Reid technique of interrogation, widely used in American policing, has been criticized for producing false confessions. It was designed to extract admissions, not to determine truth. Some jurisdictions have moved away from these methods, adopting the Pete's model, which focuses on information gathering rather than confession extraction. But change is slow. For vulnerable suspects, those with intellectual disabilities, mental illness, or simply overwhelming fear, the interrogation room can become a place where truth dies and survival instincts take over. Following his exoneration, attorneys from Kaufman Lieb Lebowitz and Frick filed a federal lawsuit on Minton's behalf. The suit targets those responsible for his wrongful conviction. The lawsuit seeks accountability for the coercive interrogation tactics, the overlooked evidence, and the 3 decades of freedom that were stolen from an innocent man. Civil lawsuits in wrongful conviction cases rarely make victims whole. No amount of money replaces 31 years. But they serve another purpose: they create consequences that might prevent future injustice. When departments face liability for coercive practices, policies change. When prosecutors face scrutiny for tunnel vision, investigations improve. Pain creates incentive for reform. What can we learn from Scott Minton's case? First, understand that false confessions happen. They happen to real people who are not guilty. They happen more often than most people want to believe. People confess to crimes they didn't commit not because they're stupid, but because they're human. Under enough pressure, anyone can break. The vulnerable break faster. Second, support recording requirements for all police interrogations. When every word is documented, coercive techniques become harder to hide and easier to challenge. Third, recognize that alibi evidence can be dismissed even when overwhelming. 18 witnesses weren't enough. Timestamp receipts weren't enough. A confession trumped everything. If you or someone you know is ever interrogated, remember, you have rights. You can remain silent. You can request an attorney. These aren't just words, they're protections. Advocate for improved eyewitness identification procedures. Research shows that initial identifications matter most. When a victim fails to identify someone the first time, that failure is significant. Support organizations doing this work. The Innocence Project. State-based innocence organizations. They're finding people like Scott Minton and fighting to set them free. And if you find these cases important, if you want to understand how the justice system fails and how it might be fixed, consider subscribing. We cover stories like this regularly. Scott Minton is now building a life he should have had decades ago. He's reconnecting with family. He's experiencing a world that changed dramatically while he was locked away. The world of 2025 is unrecognizable from the world of 1994. He missed the rise of the internet, smartphones, an entire technological revolution. He missed watching people he loved grow old. No exoneration can undo this. The legal system has mechanisms for declaring innocence, but it has no mechanism for restoring lost time. That debt can never be paid. What remains is accountability and prevention. Each wrongful conviction exposed becomes a lesson if we're willing to learn from it. Scott Minton had everything a defendant could want: documentation, witnesses, an alibi so strong it should have been unimpeachable, and still he lost 31 years. His case stands as evidence that the justice system is not infallible. It makes mistakes, and those mistakes destroy lives while the real perpetrators go free. 18 alibi witnesses weren't enough to save Scott Minton in 1994. 3 decades later, science and persistence finally did what the truth could not do alone. That's a system that needs repair. This has been Case Files Explained. I'm your host. Until next time, question everything, and remember that the difference between guilt and innocence can sometimes be measured in nothing more than vulnerability.